Right, things haven't gone quite according to plan this week. I woke up on Sunday morning and had a bit of a stretch just before getting up, as you do. And there was this weird and sickening sort of crunch between my shoulder blades, followed by a pain which I have to say took my breath away. Now, I don't know whether it's just age and mileage or whether, the last year or so of lockdowns have got something to do with this. It is getting better, but just for the moment, I can't ride, wield a spanner, or even hold a camera up to my eye without letting out a little girly scream, which sort of limits what I can do. So I thought maybe this is the perfect time to make a video which I've been sort of planning to do for several years now, but never really got round to it. Now, as you know, a few weeks ago I took delivery of a brand new Royal Enfield Continental GT, which is a sort of a factory custom, a nod to the café RACER days. The original Continental GT back in the 1960s was a very similar thing. It was a motorcycle manufacturer's reaction to a trend in order to try and grab some sales. A factory-built café RACER. And this might just be my personal view, but I believe the café RACER is the most iconic and influential genre of motorcycle that has ever graced our roads. The original café RACERs were shed-built backyard specials. They created a market that the manufacturers wanted to exploit, building their own factory versions which later gave rise to the superbikes of the 1970s and 80s. In a lot of ways, modern motorcycling owes so much to those originals 1950s and 1960s café RACERs. But for a long time now, I've felt that time has sort of diluted the true story of how these bikes originally came to be. Once again, café RACERs have come back into vogue, with the likes of Triumph and Royal Enfield as well as others currently building factory versions of these bikes, and the industry catering for parts that allow people to customise the bikes to become café RACERs, bigger than I've ever seen it in my life. In a lot of ways, it's become a sort of an international motorcycling phenomenon, especially in parts of Asia and of course the United States. And here on YouTube, if you try to research the café RACER phenomenon, I personally feel that you sort of spoon-fed the American notion of what café RACERs and the ton-up boy movement was. Now, I'm not saying that as a criticism, because café RACERs has been absorbed into other cultures, and obviously other cultures are going to have an influence on how it's perceived. But I've had the honour of knowing some of those original ton-up boys, now sadly most of them gone. Bearing in mind, a lot of these guys are now in their 80s or even in the 90s. So what I wanted to do with this video was just pull together some of the knowledge I have of those guys and their culture through many hours of wonderful conversations that I've had with them. To understand the culture of the ton-up boys and the café RACER era, you need to understand the time that it took place. 1950s England was a very different place to what it is now. The United Kingdom, as the result of World War II, was almost bankrupt. Not just because of the expense of defending the UK during World War II, but also the part that Britain played in the liberation of Europe. Those kids that later became the ton-up boys had grown up in an era of austerity. Rationing was still a huge part of their childhoods, and most major cities across the UK still bore the scars of the Blitz. It wasn't just London that was bombed by the Luftwaffe. My hometown of Hull was decimated by the Blitz, with something like 90% of residential housing either obliterated or damaged. And because of the lack of money for rebuilding, these kids grew up on bomb sites. Even though I was born 19 years after World War II ended, I remember them well. And believe it or not, even today, some of those bomb sites have not been built on because parts of the buildings that remain there are listed so those plots can't be redeveloped because no one wants to spend the money working around the listed status. Obviously, these kids grew up in an era where anti-German sentiment in the UK was at its strongest. In fact, to my recollection, it hadn't abated that much in my youth. But it's a significant factor that I will come onto in a few moments. After the war, Britain's only way out of austerity was to manufacture and export its way out of it, with all manner of products manufactured and exported to all corners of the world. It did the trick. It pulled us out of that near bankrupt situation. And by the mid-1950s, it had created a new working man's prosperity that this country had never seen before. And it created a new generation of teenagers who, for the first time in this country's history, had some bargaining power because they had money. Teenagers are naturally rebellious. Some of them chose to spend that money on motorised transport. Motorcycles, something that the parents certainly couldn't have afforded to do at their age. But they didn't see those bikes as just a way of getting to work and back. It also opened up their social lives. It provided them with an unparalleled level of freedom, something that the parents certainly hadn't enjoyed. They became disciples of the devil's music, rock and roll. And a whole new motorcycling culture was born. For the most part, they were too young for pubs, but the previous decade's growth in road haulage had provided them with a network of roadside cafes originally intended for truck drivers, gave them the perfect environment to hang out in groups and listen to music. Now, in a lot of the videos that we see nowadays representing those times, they're often represented as being guys in their early 20s or even older. But in reality, they were fresh-faced teenagers. They weren't evil, they weren't even bad lads. They were just kids that had carved out their own unique niche. The founders of the motorcycle culture that we enjoy today. They rejected the greatcoats and flat caps worn by the dads and tapped into the plentiful supply of ex-World War II military equipment. The parents were trying to forget about the war and move on. So walking around in ex-military gear was the perfect way to get up the noses. And as if that wasn't bad enough, as time went on, ex-German military equipment also found itself on the British market, with the leather jackets used by certain U-boat crews and tank commanders being the favourites. A sort of German military look became the uniform. It was meant to be controversial, but it wasn't evil. And it's something that teenagers have continued to do ever since with miniskirts or, those goth people. It was just a method these kids used to make themselves stand out from the crowd. And it was a look that continued to evolve. It didn't stay the same. Now, we hear some romantic and fanciful accounts as to what café racing was all about. But in a nutshell, from the horse's mouth, the guys that were actually there, the things that they've told me, a group of lads on the bikes would ride to a pre-designated cafe and they would hang out there for an hour or so. They would smoke a few fags, drink some tea, see who was there and see if there were any girls around. And when they got bored, they would decide to move on to another cafe. Now, you have to remember that back in those days there were no national speed limits, not until 1964 anyway. So these teenage lads riding in groups could go as fast as the bikes could carry them, and this usually develops into something of a race. So in order to be more competitive when you were out riding with your mates, you would modify your bike to get just that little bit more speed and that little bit more power out of it, constantly looking for ways of getting that competitive edge on your mates, with the cues and inspiration for modifications obviously coming from the motorcycle racing industry. And the bikes that these lads built and modified eventually became known as the Café RACER. And the explanation for them is, I'm afraid, as simple as that. You didn't win the hand of the girl of your dreams, you just beat your mate and obtain bragging rights. And when your bike became uncompetitive and you couldn't make it go any faster, you traded it in and took advantage of a new thing called hire purchase, and you got a new one. And then the whole process started again. 100 miles an hour or the ton was everyone's target, and inevitably that often ended in tragedy. The mainstream media were quick to jump on the bandwagon, vilifying motorcyclists and setting public opinion against them. But it wasn't 100% their fault. There were no helmet laws back then, there were no speed restrictions on most roads, so they weren't breaking any laws, it was just that legislation had not kept up with the pace of change. But the blame was laid fairly and squarely at the feet of these young lads. And that is, if you like, where the persecution of motorcyclists in the UK began. There's no doubt about it, these kids were tough, but they weren't the badasses that history recalls. That came later on with a different generation and for different reasons. These were just fresh-faced kids out to have some fun in a way that pleased them. There was no intention to harm anyone else. But society at large chooses to forget about that and concentrate only on the bad aspects of what happened back in those days. You only have to look at the inequality of driving tests these days to see that. With new riders in this country having to jump through flaming hoops in multi-faceted bike tests to be able to ride anything over 12 brake horsepower, whereas any kid of the same age whose parents have the means can in theory take a minimal driving test for a car and then jump behind the wheel of a 400 horsepower Ferrari, which is arguably a much more lethal weapon. This stigma, if you like, is often seen as the ton-up boys, the café RACER legacy, which is a shame because I think really they were victims of the times. A collision between mechanical ingenuity and out-of-date legislation. But the true legacy that these lads left behind is the motorcycling lifestyle and culture that we all enjoy today, along with the most iconic and influential style of motorcycle that ever turned a wheel. The muscle bike, the superbike, the street fighter and the sports bike were all derived from those early backyard specials, and we should never forget those origins. Once again, thank you so much for watching this and my other videos. I hope you found this video entertaining and useful. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel, I really would appreciate it. I am of course going to be back on Friday, so until then, if you're riding, please ride safely and I'll see you soon.